The general's voice came through the speakers like a door being shut and locked from the outside. No air support. All units copy. 4 words. That was all it took to decide the fate of 28 men. In the valley, 30 miles east of the Nevada border, those words landed like a sentence handed down by a court no one had elected. Chief Decker Holt pressed his earpiece against his skull and listened to the silence that followed. Not the silence of safety, the silence of abandonment. Around him, his men shifted behind broken walls and shattered rock, their faces streaked with dust and dried blood, their eyes doing what soldiers' eyes always do in the worst moments. They looked up. They looked at the sky, and the sky was empty. 2 miles away, in a part of the base that most people had stopped thinking about, a woman was signing paperwork. Her name was Captain Reeve Callahan. She was 38 years old, and on paper, she was a logistics officer. She managed fuel requisitions and equipment inventories and signed her name at the bottom of forms that no one would ever read twice. Her desk sat in a converted storage room with a single window that faced west, and on clear evenings, if the light was right, she could see the flight line from where she sat. She had learned not to look. She was halfway through a stack of manifests when the radio on the wall crackled. No air support. All units copy. Her pen stopped moving. She sat very still, the way certain people go still, when they hear something that cuts through all the noise of ordinary life and reaches directly into the part of them that cannot be reasoned with. Her jaw tightened, her eyes the color of winter sky just before a storm shifted toward the window. Outside, the last of the desert sun was pulling its light down behind the mountains, and the base was settling into the quiet of early evening when the day shift has gone and the night shift hasn't fully arrived, and the world between those two states belongs to no one in particular. She set her pen down on the desk. She did not pick it up again. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what happened 3 years before. And to understand that, you have to understand a man named Ferris Aldis. General Ferris Aldis was 59 years old, and he had spent 31 of those years building himself into something that looked from a distance like a great military officer. He was tall. He had the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. He wore his uniform the way some men wear their faith as both armor and advertisement. He had commendations going back to the early 90s, and he knew how to stand in photographs, and he knew how to speak at ceremonies, and he knew how to make the people above him feel that things were under control. What he did not know, or had spent 31 years pretending he did not know, was that there is a difference between looking like a great officer and being one. For most of his career, that difference had never been tested in a way that exposed it. Then came the night 3 years ago. A reconnaissance team of 15 men had gone deep into the Western Range for what was classified as a routine intelligence operation. The details of what they were doing there are still not fully public. What is public is what happened at 11:42 on a November night when their team leader broke radio silence and reported that they were surrounded, that they were taking fire, and that they needed immediate air support. Aldis was the senior officer in the command center that night. He received the call. He heard the urgency in the team leader's voice. He understood what was being asked, and then he waited. Not because he was gathering information, not because he was consulting protocol. He waited because, in that moment, the full weight of what a decision would mean landed on him all at once, and he could not move beneath it. The political exposure. The questions it would raise about why that team was in that location in the first place. The scrutiny that would follow any significant engagement. It all arrived simultaneously, and Ferris Aldis, who had built 31 years on the appearance of decisiveness, discovered in that moment that appearance and reality had grown very far apart. 9 minutes passed. In those 9 minutes, 4 men died. At the 11-minute mark, a transmission came through that no one in the command center had authorized. An A-10 Warthog had lifted off from hangar 14. No clearance, no communication with tower, just the unmistakable thunder of twin engines punching through the night. The pilot was Reeve Callahan. She had been in the ready room off-duty listening to the same radio traffic. She had waited for the order that never came. She had watched the clock. And at the 10-minute mark, she had made a decision that was not so much a decision as the absence of one, the way a river does not decide to run downhill. She flew in. The engagement lasted 19 minutes. She made 4 strafing runs. She took fire that would have driven most pilots to altitude. She flew so low that later when the ground team described it, the word they kept using was impossible. As in, it should have been impossible. As in, what she did in that canyon in that darkness with that aircraft should not have been survivable for the aircraft or the pilot inside it. She brought 11 men home. Aldis was waiting when she landed. What followed was not a debrief. It was not a conversation between 2 officers about a difficult night. What followed was Aldous' understanding, with the cold clarity of a man who has been in power long enough to see around corners, that Reeve Callahan's survival was a problem. Not because she had disobeyed orders, though she had. Not because she had created a diplomatic exposure, though there were those who claimed she had. But because she existed. Because she had been there on the same radio net. Because she had heard the same call he had heard. Because she knew exactly how many minutes had passed between that call and the moment she decided to act alone. She was not a witness to a tragedy. She was a witness to 9 minutes of cowardice. And Aldous, who had built 31 years on the architecture of his own image, could not allow that witness to keep speaking. He did not confront her. He did not accuse her. Men like Aldous are too careful for that. Instead, her commendation paperwork was lost. Her after-action report was classified at a level that buried it from normal review. Conversations happened in hallways and behind closed doors. Conversations she was not part of and never knew about in their specifics, but understood immediately in their effects. Colleagues who had known her for years stopped meeting her eyes. Invitations to briefings disappeared. Her flight status, which should have been reinstated within weeks, remained under review for months, and then the review was quietly closed without a decision, which meant no decision at all, which meant she could not fly. Within 8 months, she was behind a desk. Within a year, her name appeared on no active rosters. Within 2 years, officers who had arrived at the base after the incident had never heard of her. She had not been dishonorably discharged. She had not been court-martialed. She had been something worse. She had been made invisible, treated as though she had never existed, which for a person whose identity is bound up entirely in what they do and who they are is its own particular kind of execution. She signed the forms. She managed the inventories. She did not look at the flight line in the evenings, and she waited, though she could not have told you what she was waiting for. The A-10 Warthog has never been a beautiful aircraft. That is part of what makes it extraordinary. It looks like something designed by a committee that was told to build a flying tank and ran out of elegance before they ran out of ideas. Its fuselage is stubby and angular. Its wings are straight and wide. The cockpit sits forward like the head of something patient and predatory, and beneath that cockpit, wrapped in layers of titanium armor that can absorb rounds that would shred any other aircraft, the pilot sits in a bathtub of steel built to keep them alive when everything around them is trying to accomplish the opposite. At the center of the aircraft, extending forward of the nose gear, is the GAU-8 Avenger. It is a 7-barreled rotary cannon that weighs more than most cars and fires depleted uranium rounds at nearly 4,000 per minute. The aircraft is not built around a weapon system. In a very real sense, the aircraft is built around the cannon. Everything else is secondary to the delivery of that specific devastating truth. Pilots who have flown the Warthog speak about it the way people speak about a difficult but completely reliable friend. It is not fast, it is not graceful. It will not outrun a fighter or impress anyone at an air show. But it will take punishment that would destroy more sophisticated aircraft and keep flying. And when you need it close, when the men on the ground are close enough to the enemy that every other aircraft has to pull away, the Warthog will come down and do its work and bring its pilot home. Reeve Callahan had first climbed into an A-10 at 24 years old, and she had known immediately, with the complete certainty of someone discovering a language they were born to speak, that she had found what she was meant to do. She had 2,400 hours in type. She had flown in conditions that other pilots described in hushed voices. She had a gift for low-level work, for understanding the geometry of terrain and threat at altitudes where the margin for error is measured in feet rather than thousands of feet, where the ground is not an abstraction below you but a specific immediate reality that is trying to reach up and take you. She had not sat in a cockpit in 3 years. She was thinking about this as she walked across the tarmac toward Hangar 14. She was not running. There was something deliberate in her pace, the movement of a person who has passed the internal argument and into the action that follows it. Her boots were steady on the cracked asphalt. The desert night had dropped the temperature to something with teeth in it, and the air smelled of jet fuel and distant rain and the mineral cleanness of Nevada high desert after the sun has left it. She had not planned to come here tonight, or perhaps she had been planning it for 3 years without admitting it to herself. The hangar doors were old. They moved on rails that had not been serviced in longer than anyone could clearly remember, and they shrieked when she pulled the handle, a sound like something being torn that had been waiting years to be torn. Dust fell from the upper track in a thin curtain. She pulled harder. The door groaned back far enough to let a person through, and she stepped inside. The darkness was not complete. There were gaps in the roof panels where the last of the evening light came through in pale silver lines, and they fell across the floor in stripes that looked ceremonial. The air inside was cold and close, the cold of a space sealed for a long time, and beneath it, beneath the concrete and the age and the dust, there was something else. Jet fuel. Not the ghost of it, the real thing, recent and alive. She stopped walking. She stood in the darkness of Hangar 14 and looked at what was in front of her, and for a moment she did not breathe. The A-10 was there. It had been decommissioned. She knew this. Everyone knew this. The aircraft had been written off more than a year ago, officially scheduled for disassembly, flagged in the logistics system she managed as surplus equipment, awaiting disposal. She had seen the paperwork herself. She had in fact processed some of it. And yet, the aircraft sat on the hangar floor the way things sit when they have been cared for. Not preserved against decay, actively cared for. The paint on its fuselage was faded and worn at the edges in the way things wear when they have lived in the world, but it was clean. The landing gear was intact and properly positioned. The wheel chocks were correctly placed. Even in the half-dark, she could see that the panels were secured and flush, that nothing was hanging loose or improperly fastened. She walked toward it the way you walk towards something you are not entirely sure is real. She ran her hand along the forward fuselage. Her fingers found a shark's tooth. The mouth was still there, painted on either side of the nose, white teeth on dark, the grin that the A-10 had worn in one form or another since pilots first started painting their aircraft to look like what they were. She had touched this particular set of teeth before years ago, when this had been her aircraft, when she had walked this same circle before every flight, her hand trailing along the skin of the airplane, the way you trail your hand along the shoulder of something you trust completely. She climbed the ladder, 7 rungs. She counted them without intending to. She had climbed this ladder before and had counted them before, a habit so old she had no memory of forming it. 7 rungs. The cockpit was before her. She looked in. On the seat, placed with clear intention, was a squadron patch. It was worn at the edges. The colors had faded to something approximate of their original red and black and gold. The embroidered outline of the aircraft was still clear. The motto across the bottom, which she had long since committed to a place deeper than memory, was still legible. It was her patch. The patch of the squadron, disbanded in the aftermath of everything that had happened 3 years ago. She had thought it was gone. She had not let herself think about it. She picked it up. Beneath it was a piece of paper. Not a printed form. Handwriting. Round, deliberate script she recognized before she read the words. Script she had seen on maintenance logs and equipment sign-outs for years. Fuel full, guns loaded. She missed you. And at the bottom, a single initial K. She sat down in the cockpit. She did not do it deliberately so much as the cockpit received her the way a chair in a room you have lived in for years receives you without requiring thought, with the accommodation of something shaped by long use. The seat, the instrument panel, the curve of the canopy overhead. All of it returned to her the way the smell of a place returns after a long absence, not slowly but all at once, complete. Sergeant Dana Kowalski had been her crew chief for 4 years before the reassignment. She was 41 years old and had been maintaining military aircraft since she was 19, and she approached every aircraft she was responsible for with the focused proprietary care of someone who understood that the difference between a well-maintained aircraft and a poorly maintained one was a person coming home or not. She had a habit of talking to the aircraft while she worked, a running commentary on what she was finding and what she thought about it, not self-conscious, simply the manner of a person who spends enough time with something that conversation becomes natural. She had been reassigned to a forward operating location after the incident. The posting was technically a lateral move and was transparently a punishment. She was 300 miles from Reeve Callahan, and she had not been consulted and she had not complained, because Kowalski was a person who kept her protests interior and her actions exterior. She said very little. She did a great deal. For 3 years she had been coming back, not continuously, not openly, but in the space of maintenance rotations and leave periods, in the ordinary movement of personnel through a base system large enough to obscure individual patterns, she had found her way back to Hangar 14 on a regular basis and done what she knew how to do. She had kept the fuel current. She had kept the systems functional. She had done this without orders and without budget and without any assurance that it would ever matter. Reeve looked at the dust turning slowly in the light coming through the roof gap above the cockpit. She thought about 3 years of paperwork. She thought about 28 men in a valley 30 miles east. She reached out and set the squadron patch on the instrument panel at the base of the heads-up display in the location where it had always sat, held by worn fabric against the slight texture of the panel. Not secured, not fastened. Simply placed as it had been on every flight she had ever flown in this aircraft. The way some pilots carry photographs, and some carry coins, and some carry nothing except the weight of everything they have already survived. She began to run the pre-start checklist. Her hands moved through it the way hands move through something practiced, past the point of thought. Left hand fuel pumps, right hand avionics master. Eyes moving across the panel in the scan she had run so many times, it had become less a procedure than a rhythm, a kind of prayer said in the language of switches and gauges and indicator lights that she had been speaking since she was 24 years old. The systems woke slowly the way old things wake, with reluctance and then commitment. Indicator lights blinked green one at a time, each one a small confirmation that something still worked, that the years had not been enough to kill it. She did not allow herself to feel anything about this. She focused on the checklist. In the main operations building, 2 miles away, General Ferris Aldous was standing at the window of the command center with a cup of coffee that had gone cold in his hand, looking at nothing in particular when the sound reached him. It was faint at first. The base produced noise constantly, the background hum and clatter of a large military installation running through its evening rhythms. But there are certain sounds that cut through background noise, not because they are louder than everything else, but because they are precise in a way the brain is trained to recognize. And Ferris Aldous had spent enough years near flight lines that a jet engine starting even at distance, even through walls and across tarmac, registered in him at a level below conscious thought. He turned from the window. He looked at the communications officer across the room. The young man was already reaching for his headset, already looking up with an expression that asked the question before he spoke it. "Sir, we have an unscheduled engine start. Hangar 14. Aldous stood with his coffee cup and did not speak for a moment. Hangar 14 had been decommissioned. The aircraft in Hangar 14 had been decommissioned. There was no pilot assigned to Hangar 14. There was nothing in Hangar 14 that should have been making any sound at all, let alone the sound that was now growing, deepening, the twin turbofans of an A-10 cycling up from cold start through idle and beginning their climb toward operational power. A sound less like machinery than like something alive asserting its existence after a long silence. Hangar 14. He knew who was in Hangar 14. He had always known on some level that this moment was possible. That Reeve Callahan was still on this base, still within range of that particular aircraft, was not an accident of administration. He had chosen not to think about what that proximity meant. He had handled it the way you handle a problem you cannot solve and cannot admit to, which is to build enough smaller things around it that you can almost forget it is there. He had not forgotten. He reached for the phone on the console beside him. He held it. Outside, the sound of the engines grew. The coffee cup in his other hand was cold, and he had not noticed until this moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. The young communications officer watched him and waited. He thought about a radio transmission from 3 years ago, a team leader's voice, the specific texture of urgency in it. He thought about 9 minutes and what 9 minutes costs when the people spending them do not have them to spare. He thought about Reeve Callahan's face on the tarmac after she landed, when she had stepped down from the aircraft and seen him waiting, and understood in the way that direct people understand things, not gradually but all at once, what was going to happen next. She had not begged. She had not argued. She had looked at him with those storm gray eyes, and she had known, and he had known that she knew, and neither of them had said the specific true thing that was in the air between them. He set the phone down. He turned back to the window. The sound of the engines was full now, filling the desert evening with its authority, rolling out across the tarmac and the flight line, and the flat, dark expanse of the base, the way a statement rolls into a room impossible to take back, claiming the space it enters. The communications officer said quietly, "Sir, she's rolling out." Aldous said nothing. He stood at the window with the cold coffee cup in his hand and watched the shape of the A-10 emerge from the darkness of the hangar apron and begin to move slowly at first, and then, with the building momentum of something committed toward the runway. Its position lights blinked in the darkness. Its running lights caught the edge of the taxiway markers. He did not call it back. He would tell himself later that he was still deciding. That the call simply had not been made yet, that he was working through a procedural sequence in his mind, and the aircraft happened to reach the runway before that sequence was complete. He would tell himself this. But in the window in the reflection, he could see his own face, and the expression on it was not the expression of a man still deciding. The A-10 accelerated. The sound of it hit the building like something physical, a vibration that traveled through the glass and into the hand that held it and into the chest behind that hand. And Captain Reeve Callahan, who had not flown in 3 years, who had been told in every institutional way available that she was not what she knew, she was pulled back on the stick. She had been born to hold and felt the Warthog answer her the way it had always answered her, with its whole, enormous, ugly, magnificent self, with everything it had, without hesitation, as though it had simply been waiting for her to ask. The altimeter began to climb. Below her, the lights of the base fell away. Ahead of her, the mountains were dark shapes against a darker sky, and beyond them, 30 miles east, 28 men were alive and waiting and had not yet given up entirely on the possibility that something might still come out of the night to find them. She checked the squadron patch on the panel. She set her course. She flew. The valley had no name on most maps. It appeared on military topographical charts as a grid reference, a sequence of numbers and letters that described its location without describing what it was, which was a long, narrow corridor of broken ground between two ridgelines floored with loose shale and scattered scrub, walled on both sides by rock faces that rose steeply enough to limit exit options to three directions, two of which were now compromised. Chief Decker Holt had chosen this position 40 minutes ago because it offered the best available cover and the most defensible sightlines given what he had to work with, which was 28 men in varying states of exhaustion, limited ammunition, no air support, and the clarity of mind that arrives when a person has stripped away every option except the ones that are actually available. He was 44 years old, and he had been in situations like this before. Not identical but recognizable situations where the geometry of the problem reduced itself to its simplest possible form: how long can we hold, and what happens when we can't? He had 20 years of answers to that question, and none of them were comfortable, and all of them had taught him something. What they had mostly taught him was that the difference between situations that resolved and situations that didn't was not always skill or training or firepower. Sometimes it was time. Sometimes it was simply whether something changed before the clock ran out. Tonight the clock was running. Private Tyler Hatch was 19 feet to Holt's left behind what remained of a stone wall that had probably been part of a livestock enclosure sometime before the current century and was now performing a different kind of service. Hatch was 22 years old, and this was his first deployment, and he was doing what young soldiers do when they are frightened, which is to perform exactly what they were trained to do, while something underneath the training does its own work in the silence between actions. Holt had been watching him the way he watched all his young people, with the peripheral attention of someone who needs to do many things at once and has learned to monitor the human element while managing everything else. The mortar round that hit 30 meters to the north sent shale skittering across both of them. Hatch pressed himself flat before the order arrived in his mind. Holt keyed his radio. What he heard instead of a response was silence, and then a transmission from an enemy intercept. Someone had patched through a voice speaking in accented English with the contempt of someone who believes the outcome is already settled. No angels in your sky tonight, Americans. No one is coming for you. Hatch heard it. He turned his head toward Holt without raising it from the ground. His face in the half-dark was young and serious, and he did not say anything. But the question was there the way questions are there in young soldiers' faces when the situation has moved past what their training fully covered. Holt said, "Stay low and make them work for every inch." It was not an answer, it was a task. Sometimes a task is the most honest thing you can offer. He did not tell Hatch that the mortars were walking closer with each impact adjusting by the sound of their own detonations, the way trained crews adjust, and that the current trajectory suggested the next one would land within 15 meters. He did not tell Hatch that the APCs grinding through the far end of the valley had not been on any of the intelligence briefings they had received before this operation, which meant either the intelligence had been wrong or something else entirely had happened, something he had no framework for yet. He pressed his earpiece and tried command again. The response he received was not from command, it was a sound. At first it was absorbed into the background of the night, the wind, and the distant machinery of enemy movement. But it grew, taking on dimension and authority, and Holt had spent enough of his life near flight lines and forward operating bases that the character of twin turbofan engines cycling up to military power registered in him before it had fully registered as sound rather than sensation. He looked up. For a moment there was nothing visible, only the dark ridge line against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. Then he saw the navigation lights, red and green and white, moving low and fast along the eastern ridge, lower than any aircraft should have been flying in this terrain, at this speed low enough that he could hear the airframe now beneath the engine noise. A different note, the sound of something moving through air at a velocity the air is not quite willing to accept. He watched it come. The A-10 crossed the valley entrance at an altitude that made him involuntarily press himself a few inches lower, not from rational threat assessment, but from the physical fact of something large moving very fast, very close. Its wingtip lights strobed twice in the darkness. Then it banked hard left in a turn that used the terrain as though the terrain were a resource rather than an obstacle, and in the turn the belly of the aircraft caught enough ambient light from the burning APC at the valley floor that he saw the shark mouth, for a moment white teeth on dark fuselage, and then the aircraft was past the visible angle, and only the sound remained. Then the GAU-8 spoke. There is no adequate description of the sound of an A-10's cannon firing in close terrain at night. It has been described as a very large piece of fabric tearing, which is accurate at distance. Up close, it is something else entirely, something that occupies the chest cavity rather than just the ears, a physical event that the body responds to before the mind has processed what it is hearing. The sound lasted approximately 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, the leading APC at the valley floor ceased to exist as a functional vehicle and became instead a burning collection of its former components spread across a radius of 30 meters. The valley went briefly silent, then it went louder than before. Holt was already moving, directing his men into the gap the strike had opened, his voice carrying the quality that voices carry when the body has stopped conserving energy for anything except the immediate work. The enemy infantry that had been following the APC scattered into the margins of the valley floor, their organization disrupted by the loss of their forward armoros and the knowledge that something overhead had entered the calculation. Hatch ran, not gracefully or strategically in these first seconds. He ran the way young soldiers run when an unexpected opportunity appears and the body acts before the mind has formed the plan. He ran toward better cover, and when he reached the second wall and pressed himself against it, he looked up at the sky with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite disbelief, but something that held both. Holt keyed his radio to the emergency frequency. Unknown aircraft, this is Echo Team. Identify and state intentions. The response came back, clipped and level. A woman's voice, no wasted words. Echo, this is Warthog inbound. I have you visually. Mark your position with smoke. North wall preferred. Holt processed this for exactly the amount of time it took him to reach into his kit and pull a smoke canister. He did not ask who was flying. He did not ask how they had gotten clearance, because the sound of those engines and the fact that command had explicitly denied air support told him that clearance was not a factor in this aircraft's current operation. He pulled the pin and threw. White smoke curled up from the north wall in a pale column against the dark. The A-10 banked into it. In the command center 2 miles away, the track of the A-10 on the radar display was doing things that the duty officer was finding difficult to explain in the language of standard flight operations. It was not following a vector the way normal aircraft follow vectors. It was moving through the terrain the way something moves when it has a detailed, intimate relationship with the ground below it, using altitude as a resource, treating the ridgelines as features rather than hazards. Aldous watched the display. He had said nothing since the aircraft launched. His communications officer had made 2 attempts to hail the aircraft on standard frequencies and received no response on either. The aircraft's transponder was operating, which meant it was visible to anyone looking, which meant whoever was flying it had decided visibility was acceptable, that the only thing that mattered was the work and not the record of it. He recognized this logic. The duty officer said, "Sir, we have 2 F-16Es on combat patrol in Sector 7, within intercept range if you want to issue a directive." Aldous looked at the radar display. The A-10's track showed it completing a second gun run. Another burning vehicle marker appeared on the ground picture. He said, "Get them on frequency." Captain James Wren and Lieutenant David Caulfield had been on combat patrol for 2 hours and 40 minutes and had seen nothing requiring action, and were at that point of an uneventful night patrol where the mind is alert but not engaged. Then the A-10 appeared on their radar returns at an altitude that made Wren check his display twice, because what it was showing him was an aircraft operating below safe terrain clearance for that area. And yet it was not hitting the terrain, it was navigating it. He pulled up the track history and watched the lines of the aircraft's path relative to the ground contours, and understood in the way that pilots understand other pilots flying that what he was looking at was not recklessness. It was skill of a very specific and rare kind. His radio crackled. Command frequency. Wren Caulfield. This is Aldous. I need you to escort that A-10 to a landing. Non-aggressive intercept. Pull alongside and direct it to the nearest available runway. Copy. Wren keyed his mic. Copy, sir. Commencing intercept. He rolled his aircraft toward the valley. They came down on either side of the A-10 in a textbook intercept geometry, 1 aircraft on each wing, close enough to be clearly visible, their position lights blinking in the international signal for follow me. The A-10 continued on its track without deviation. For a moment, all three aircraft flew in a formation no one had planned, one pilot and one general working out through the medium of aircraft positions, a negotiation that could not be conducted in words. Wren switched to the guard frequency. Unidentified A-10. This is your escort. You are ordered to follow us to landing. Acknowledge. The A-10 did not respond. It completed its turn, lined up on a target at the valley floor, and the cannon fired again. Below them, another vehicle became fire and light. Then Reeve Callahan's voice came through on the guard frequency. She did not shout. She did not argue. She spoke in the flat, factual register of someone communicating tactical information and nothing more. 2 aircraft on my wings. You heard the same radio traffic I heard tonight. There are 28 people on that valley floor. They have been told no one is coming. Whatever you decide to do next, you're going to have to live with it. I already know what I'm going to do. Wren looked at the ground picture. He looked at the burning vehicles on the valley floor. He looked at the smoke marker rising from the friendly unit's position, and he did a calculation that had nothing to do with orders and everything to do with what a person can look at in a mirror the following morning. It was not an easy calculation. He was 29 years old, and he had been given a direct order by a general officer, and he understood what it meant to disobey that order, and he sat with the full weight of that understanding for the seconds that the situation gave him. Then he moved his aircraft. He banked left away from the A-10's wing and keyed his radio to command frequency. Sir, we have lost visual on the target aircraft. Caulfield's aircraft followed. The A-10's track continued uninterrupted on the display. Aldous heard the transmission in the command center. The communications officer turned toward him, waiting. Aldous said nothing. He walked to the window. In the valley, Holt watched the 2 F-16 turn away and felt something that was not quite relief, because relief implies the removal of danger, and the danger was still very much present. But something had shifted in the calculus of the night. He could not have named it precisely. He filed it away and moved his attention back to the immediate situation. He keyed the emergency frequency. Warthog Echo, we have infantry flanking east wall, approximately 30 units. They have our smoke. Immediate response, copy. Relocate your smoke, 30 seconds. He pulled his men 15 meters north. New canister, blue smoke. The old white plume was still visible, and for 30 seconds it served as a marker pointing at where they no longer were. The A-10 came in low along the eastern wall, not at the infantry directly, but at the rock face above them, its cannon rounds impacting the upper scree slope and sending a cascade of rock and dust down across the flanking approach. Not a perfect solution, a creative one. Using the terrain itself as a force multiplier, the weight of displaced rock adding to the effect of the rounds. Hatch watched this from behind his wall. He said quietly to no one in particular, "She knows this valley." Holt heard it. He turned the word "she" over once. He had heard a woman's voice on the radio. He had a name for it now, or something close to a name. A description that had been passed between soldiers for years, in the way stories pass between people who have been present at significant things and come back needing to put language to them. He had heard it from a reconnaissance team leader named Garrett, who had survived something in the Western Range 2 or 3 years before Holt had arrived at this base, and who had described it in the way survivors describe the moment the situation changed, with a mixture of precision and something that never quite resolved into ordinary narrative. Garrett had said it was a woman. "I never got a name. They didn't give us a name, but I heard her voice on the comms once. She said, 'I've got you.' That was all." Holt had filed this alongside other things soldiers told him. Not disbelieved, simply held in suspension. Now he looked at the A-10 completing its 3rd gun run, and he thought about Garrett's voice telling that story. The quality of it, the texture of something true. He looked at Hatch. He said, "Keep moving, kid. Don't stop." The 4th gun run went slightly wide, not dangerously wide, but professionally, so the pilot pulling off early rather than risk the rounds walking into the friendly position as the aircraft's angle changed through the run. Holt saw it and understood the ammunition was beginning to impose its logic on the situation. Every trigger pull was a subtraction from a finite total. He keyed his radio. "Warthog Echo, what's your status on guns?" A pause, then getting there. He looked at the enemy position and made his own assessment. The direct armor threat was substantially reduced. The infantry threat was disrupted, but not eliminated. The mortars had stopped, which meant either the crew had been hit or they had moved, and moving mortars took time, which was a gift he had not asked for and intended to use. He began to move his people. 20 years had taught him that the window between the disruption of an enemy and their recovery was the most valuable real estate on any battlefield, more valuable than high ground or cover or firepower, because it was time, and time was the resource everything else depended on. He moved his people through the gap, with the efficiency of someone who has spent 2 decades practicing exactly this low and fast, and in the sequence that exposed the fewest people to the most dangerous ground for the shortest possible duration. Hatch moved when Holt moved him and covered when Holt told him to cover, and did not ask questions. He was no longer the soldier who had pressed himself flat and asked silently if they were going to die. He had not stopped being afraid. He had found something to do with it. They reached the secondary position, a deeper cut in the western wall that offered both cover and concealment, and a sight line down the valley significantly better than what they had left. Holt counted his people in, all present. He allowed himself exactly the amount of time it took to count them, and then he turned his attention back to the radio. The A-10 was on its 5th gun run when the tone changed. He did not hear the missile launch. What he heard was a change in the quality of the aircraft's engine note, a sudden application of power that had a different character than the gun run applications, more urgent, less purposeful, the sound of an aircraft responding to threat rather than prosecuting one. Then the aircraft's track changed, climbing and turning simultaneously in a maneuver that pulled it away from the valley floor and up toward the ridgeline, in a trajectory that looked from below almost violent in its abruptness. A streak of light crossed the sky to the east, fast and straight, and then curving slightly as its guidance system adjusted. The aircraft was already past where the streak expected it to be, and the detonation when it came was behind and above the A-10's position, close enough to be serious, far enough to be survivable. The valley went quiet. Holt pressed his earpiece. Warthog, confirmed status. 90 seconds of silence. He waited. He did not fill the silence with requests or expressions of concern. He waited the way people who understand radio discipline wait, which is completely without adding noise to a channel someone else may need. Then her voice came back. It was different from the previous transmissions, not in its composure, which was unchanged, but in something beneath the composure, something that the clipped professional register could not entirely contain, the way a structure shows the stress it is under, not by collapsing, but by the quality of its stillness. She said, "Holt." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "I haven't flown in 3 years. They told me I wasn't a pilot anymore. I need you to know that before I come back in." He heard it, the full weight of it. Not the tactical information of which there was none, but the thing beneath what she was telling him that had nothing to do with aircraft or ammunition or enemy positions. She was telling him who she was. She was doing it now in the middle of this because the 90 seconds of silence had been the moment in which she had decided that if something went wrong on the next run, she wanted someone on the ground to know that she had been here, that she had tried, that she was not the logistics officer or the erased file or the signature at the bottom of forms no one read. She was the pilot. Decker Holt had been in the military for 20 years, and in those 20 years, he had developed a considered skepticism about most things and most people, the kind that comes from watching the gap between what institutions claim to value and what they actually reward. He did not consider himself a sentimental man. He considered himself a practical one, which he believed was a higher form of honesty. He keyed his radio. He said, "Callahan, 3 hours ago I told my youngest man that no one was coming for us tonight. He believed me because I was telling him the truth as I understood it. You changed what the truth was. You gave 28 people 3 hours they didn't have. Whatever they told you in the last 3 years about who you are, that is not the true version." A pause. He said, "Come back in." 14 feet away, Tyler Hatch had turned his face toward the wall. His shoulders moved once. He did not make a sound. Holt let him have the moment without comment, which was a form of respect he had learned to offer young soldiers in their first genuine encounters with what combat actually is. The A-10's engines came back up in the darkness above them. She was coming back in. The 6th gun run cleared the southern approach the enemy had been using to bring up replacement infantry, the ground erupting along a line that ended the route as a viable axis of movement. It was precise work, the kind that comes not from technology alone, but from a complete understanding of what the weapon can do and what the terrain will do with it, how the rounds will distribute, where the secondary effects will go. Holt watched it and thought again about Garrett's voice. He could estimate the ammunition state from the duration and character of the gun runs, and his estimate was that she was very close to the end of what she had available. The last 2 runs had been shorter. The intervals had become the intervals of someone rationing the last of a finite thing. Then her voice came through on the emergency frequency, professional, and clipped, but underneath it the sound of effort, the effort people make when the situation has moved past comfortable and into the territory where the only available option is to keep going. She said, "Echo, I need to break off. Gun's nearly dry. I'm going to find a pit stop. Hold what you have." He said, "Copy." "How long?" She said, depends on the road. And then the aircraft was climbing out of the valley, its engines receding into the dark above the ridgeline, and the valley was quiet again in the way that places go quiet when what was protecting them has temporarily left. Not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of a pause, something held rather than something gone. Hatch said, she's coming back. It was not a question. It was the statement of someone who had decided to believe something, not because the evidence was overwhelming, but because the alternative required giving up on it, and he was not ready to do that. Holt said, she said she was. Hatch looked at him. Holt said, she hasn't lied to us yet. The forward arming and refueling point that appeared in some administrative records as Station Kilo Spur existed because Sergeant Dana Kowalski had argued for its establishment 3 years ago, before the reassignment that had moved her out of the main base and into the margins of the operational picture. She had argued for it on practical grounds, in the language of logistics and response time and force multiplication, and the argument had been accepted because it was a good argument that also happened to serve a purpose the people approving it were not thinking about. She had been thinking about a specific aircraft and a specific pilot, and the possibility that one day those two things would need each other in a place far from the main base. The station was a converted service road long enough for an emergency landing if the pilot was skilled enough and willing to accept what a surface not designed for aircraft imposes on aircraft and pilots. Kowalski had maintained it the way she maintained the aircraft in Hangar 14, in the margins of her authorized duties with her own time and with the quiet stubbornness of someone who has decided that something is necessary and has not received permission to stop believing that. She heard the engines before the aircraft was visible. She recognized them. She had serviced that airframe long enough that its engine note was information the way a familiar voice is information telling you something before any visual confirmation arrives. She began moving before the navigation lights appeared over the ridge. Her crew was small. 2 NCOs who had been told only that there might be an emergency recovery tonight and who had asked no questions because they had worked for Kowalski long enough to understand that her information was reliable, even when its sourcing was unclear. They moved to their positions. The headlights of the vehicles on both sides of the strip came on. The flood lamp Kowalski had rigged from salvaged equipment blinked to life at the far end, casting a pool of white light across the cracked asphalt. The A-10 appeared over the ridgeline at an angle that made one of the NCOs take an involuntary step back. It was not flying cleanly. The right wing had a heaviness to it that well-maintained aircraft are not supposed to have, a reluctance in the roll that suggested something in the flight control system was working harder than it should. Kowalski watched the approach with the attention of someone reading a patient's condition from the way they enter a room. She saw what the aircraft was doing and what it was costing. The landing was not graceful. It was surviving. The aircraft came down hard on the main gear bounce once in the way. That very heavy aircraft bounced on surfaces not designed for them, and then the nose gear came down and the brakes applied and the tires screamed on the cracked asphalt, and the aircraft ran most of the length of the strip before it slowed to taxi speed and turned very slowly toward the fuel point. Kowalski was at the ladder before the engines had fully spooled down. The canopy opened. Reeve Callahan pulled her oxygen mask down and looked at Dana Kowalski, and for a moment neither of them spoke. There are reunions that require words, and there are those that do not, and this was the latter, the kind where the situation is too large and too immediate for the language the ordinary relationship requires. Kowalski said, 4 minutes, maybe 5, if you're careful with the pressure transfer. Reeve said 4 is enough. Kowalski started the fuel transfer. Her crew began reloading the cannon, the ammunition belts going in with the practiced efficiency of people who have rehearsed exactly this. Reeve did not shut down. She sat in the open cockpit in the night air, with the engines at idle, and watched the activity below her, and allowed herself exactly the rest that 4 minutes permitted, which was not very much. Kowalski climbed the ladder until she was at eye level with the cockpit. She reached into her jacket. She held out an envelope. It was not large. It had been folded and unfolded enough times that the paper was soft at the creases. No address, no official markings. Just handwriting on the outside 3 names and beneath the names for Captain Callahan when she can be found. Reeve looked at it. Kowalski said 3 of the 11, from that night 3 years ago. They spent 2 years trying to find me. They didn't know how to find you. I told them I'd hold it until the right moment. Reeve said nothing. Kowalski said, I think this is the right moment. Reeve took the envelope. She held it without opening it. Then she opened the flap and removed the letter and unfolded it and read the first few lines, and whatever was in those lines did something to her face that was visible, even in the difficult light of the strip, a movement in the jaw and around the eyes that lasted only a moment before the control returned. She folded the letter. She placed it in the leg pocket of her flight suit behind the squadron patch. She had moved there from the instrument panel before the landing approach. She looked at Kowalski. She said, "Thank you." Kowalski said, "Bring the jet back." Reeve said, "I'll bring it back with dents." Kowalski said, "I know. I'll fix them." She descended the ladder. Reeve pulled her mask back into place. The fuel transfer completed. The crew stepped clear. Kowalski moved to the wing and gave the signal and stepped back. At the end of the strip, headlights suddenly swept across the asphalt. A military transport moving fast, turning onto the service road from the junction. It slowed as the driver registered the scene, the aircraft, the ground crew, the active fuel equipment. A door opened. A man in uniform climbed out and identified himself as acting on orders from command, and his voice carried official authority and genuine conviction because he was following orders he had received in good faith and he believed in what he was doing. Kowalski looked at the vehicle. She looked at the aircraft. One of the NCOs turned toward her. She did not look back. She was watching the aircraft. The engines were climbing through idle now, the sound deepening as the throttles advanced. She said to her crew, "Clear the chocks." The man shouted something about orders and consequences. He was not wrong about the consequences. He was wrong about whether the consequences changed anything. She stepped into the strip. She put her arms out, not to stop the aircraft, to stop the vehicles. She stood between them and the runway with her arms extended, and she did not move, and the vehicles stopped because the alternative was to drive through her, and no one in those vehicles was prepared to do that. The A-10's engines hit military power. The aircraft rolled. The man was still speaking, his voice absorbed by the engine noise the way voices are absorbed completely without remainder. The aircraft built speed down the strip, its landing lights throwing a cone of white forward into the dark, and at the point where the asphalt ended and the desert began, it rotated, the nose lifting, the gear separating from the surface. The whole vast, ungainly, magnificent structure lifting itself into the Nevada night by the authority of physics and will, in 20 years of practice and 3 years of waiting. The gear retracted. The aircraft climbed. Kowalski stood in the middle of the strip with her arms still out and watched it go until the navigation lights were indistinguishable from the stars. Then she lowered her arms. She walked back to the fuel equipment and began the shutdown procedure. She was not worried. She had been watching Reeve Callahan fly for 4 years, and she had learned to distinguish between the situations that were genuinely final and the situations that only appeared to be. This was not the first kind. She looked east toward the valley, toward the dark sky above the ridgeline, where nothing was visible yet, but where she knew with the confidence of someone who has done her part and trusts the person who must do the rest, that something was flying back through the dark with everything it had left. The valley came back to her the way it had come to her the first time, fast and low and with its full demand for complete attention. She had been airborne for 6 minutes since leaving Kowalski's strip, 6 minutes in which the second fuel load had settled into the aircraft's balance, and the fresh ammunition belts had given the Avenger its weight back, and the desert below her had transitioned from flat scrub into the first broken terrain marking the approaches to the valley. She crossed the ridgeline at the same altitude she had used all night. Below her, the friendly position markers were where she had left them, still holding. The enemy armor that had regrouped during her absence had moved into the valley's southern approach while she was gone, which was exactly what she had expected them to do. She had 40 minutes of fuel and a full load of rounds and one more functioning hydraulic circuit than she had carried on the first departure. She rolled in. The Samlock tone when it came was a different frequency than the shoulder-fired threats she had been managing all night. She heard it and knew the difference immediately, the way a doctor hears a change in a patient's breathing and knows before any instrument confirms it that something has shifted fundamentally. The previous threats had been reactive, their geometry compromised by the gun runs their crews scattered and working under pressure. This was different. This was a radar-guided system, fixed, calculated patient, the kind that does not panic and does not improvise, the kind that simply establishes its solution and waits for the geometry to align. She had perhaps 4 seconds before that moment arrived. She cut the throttles. The A-10 dropped as though something beneath it had been removed, its lift suddenly insufficient for its weight, the altimeter spinning counterclockwise in a way that in any other context would have been an emergency in itself. The fuselage shuddered with the violence of the maneuver, every bolt and panel and weld in the airframe transmitting the stress load of what she was asking it to do. The missile, its seeker head, tracking the thermal signature of engines that were no longer producing the output it had locked onto, overcorrected. It dove. She hit the throttles again. The engines answered with everything they had left, which was not what they had at the beginning of the night, but was still in this moment enough. The aircraft climbed back through the altitude it had sacrificed, nose up the ridgeline close enough on the right side that she could see individual rock formations in the glow of the burning vehicles below, and the missile, unable to recover from its overcorrection in time, detonated 40 meters below and behind her. The shockwave hit the airframe like a fist. She held on. The right wing came up first, then the left, and for a moment the aircraft was not flying, so much as insisting on flying the way certain things insist on continuing, simply because they have not yet been given a sufficient reason to stop. Alarms she had not heard tonight added their voices to the ones already speaking. She silenced 3 of them on the basis that they were telling her things she already knew and could not address in the next 60 seconds, and left the others because they were telling her things she needed to track. She rolled back toward the valley floor. In the ruins where Holt had established his command position, the detonation behind the ridge had produced a silence followed by a quality of waiting that was different from the other silences of the night. Not empty, full. Full of what might come next and what might not. Hatch had his back against the wall and his rifle across his knees and his eyes on the sky above the eastern ridgeline, and for the 12 seconds between the detonation and the reappearance of the aircraft's navigation lights, he did not appear to breathe. Then the lights came back, low, fast, the engine note climbing back up through the full range of sounds the A-10 made when it was working. Hatch exhaled. He looked at Holt, who had been watching the same piece of sky, and Holt looked back at him, and neither of them said anything, because what was happening in the sky above them was saying it better than they could. The final gun run was not elegant. It was not meant to be. Elegance is what precision looks like when there is sufficient resource to achieve it cleanly, and Reeve Callahan had by this point moved past sufficient resource into final resource, where the only available approach is to spend what remains completely and make certain it counts. She lined up on the densest concentration of enemy infantry remaining in the valley, the cluster working its way along the western wall toward Holt's position, and she held the trigger down. The GAU-8 fired in a continuous burst longer than any single burst she had fired all night. The valley floor erupted in a line from south to north, the rounds walking through the western approach, with the finality of a door being permanently closed. The sound of it was enormous and brief, and then it was gone, and what followed was a quality of silence that had a different character than any silence before it, the silence of a situation that has been definitively altered rather than temporarily disrupted. The surviving enemy did not regroup. They withdrew, not in an organized withdrawal. In the way things withdraw when the calculation of continuing has become insupportable, when the combination of what has already happened and what has just happened and what might happen next exceeds the tolerance of the people being asked to absorb it. They moved back into the dark beyond the valley mouth, and the sounds of their movement diminished and then disappeared, and the valley became simply a valley again, cold and dark, and holding the evidence of everything that had happened in it without comment. Holt stood up. He had not fully stood upright in over an hour, and the act of straightening produced protests from parts of his body that he noted and set aside. He looked north along the western wall. He looked south toward the valley mouth. He counted his people, all present, all alive. Some injured, one with a wound to the left arm that would require attention before dawn, but that was not going to kill him in the next few hours. He keyed his radio. He said, "Warthog, this is Echo. Valley is clear. They've pulled back. You did it." He waited. Then her voice, steady and unhurried, copy Echo. "Good work down there." He noticed what she had said and what she had not said. Good work down there. As though the work had been his and hers together. As though neither of them had done it alone. Which was true and which she had known to say. He said, "Can you make the strip?" She said, "Working on it." The right engine was producing less than it should have been. She had been tracking it for the past several minutes as it delivered its incremental reports on the accumulated cost of the night. But the change now was different in character, not the sound of stress. The sound of damage expressing itself, a roughness in the right engine that had not been there before the final missile detonation, a slight asymmetry between the two turbofans suggesting the right side had taken something it was struggling to accommodate. And then in the dark sky above the southern ridgeline, Holt saw it. Fire. A trail of it, orange and thin, coming from the right wing root area. The kind of fire an aircraft can carry for a period of time before it cannot. He pressed his earpiece. "Callahan, you're trailing fire from the right wing." "Confirm you see it." Her voice came back. "I see it." He said, "Kowalski's strip." She said, "If it holds together long enough?" He said, "It will." There was a pause. She said, "You don't know that." He said, "No, but you're going to fly it like it will." The silence that followed was not empty. It was the silence of a person receiving something and deciding what to do with it. Then copy. the aircraft turned south. Its navigation lights moved across the sky above the valley, trailing the thin orange line of the fire at the wing root, climbing slightly and then leveling as she established her course toward the service road and whatever was left of the night. Hatch watched it go. He said, "She's going to make it." Holt did not respond immediately. He was already assessing what needed to happen in the next 30 minutes. The movement of his people to the pickup zone, the medical priorities, the communications he needed to establish. His mind was doing what it did, working the sequence forward and identifying the tasks in order. But he let himself, for the length of one breath, simply watch the navigation lights moving south across the dark sky. He said, "She is." The landing on Kowalski's Strip was the most violent controlled event that Dana Kowalski had witnessed in 22 years of maintaining military aircraft. She had watched a great many landings in those 22 years. Emergency landings, crosswind landings, landings on damaged gear, and landings in conditions that grounded everything else. She had developed over those years a precise and calibrated sense of what a landing looked like when it was being managed successfully and what it looked like when it was something other than that. This landing was being managed, barely, with everything the pilot had. The A-10 came over the ridge at the northern end of the strip with a fire at its right wing root larger than it had been, the orange trail now thick enough to cast light on the lower fuselage, and the aircraft's approach angle was steeper than it should have been, and its airspeed higher than was optimal for this surface, and its right wing was low in a way that indicated the flight control system was compensating for something it was not fully able to compensate for. Kowalski stood at the edge of the strip and watched it come and did not move and did not look away. The gear came down, both mains in the nose. She saw them extend and lock and allowed herself the small increment of relief that a complete gear extension permits when everything else about the approach is deeply uncertain. The aircraft crossed the threshold. The mains hit the asphalt, and the aircraft came down hard, and the right main strut compressed in a way that threw the right wing lower before the strut rebounded, and the aircraft bounced. And during the bounce, the left wing came up far enough that the right wingtip was very close to the surface. And if it had touched at that moment and at that speed, the result would have been unrecoverable. It did not touch. The nose gear came down and the brakes applied, and the aircraft ran the length of the strip in a shimmy of tortured rubber and screaming hydraulics, and then slowed and then stopped. And the fire at the right wing root continued for 11 seconds before the onboard suppression system addressed it, and then there was smoke instead of fire. And then there was only the sound of cooling metal and the smell of everything the aircraft had spent to get here. Kowalski ran. She reached the ladder before the canopy was fully open and went up the rungs without counting them, which she had never done before, and when she looked into the cockpit, she saw Reeve Callahan sitting with both hands still on the controls, her helmet still on, her oxygen mask still in place, not moving. She said, "Reeve." Reeve did not respond immediately. Kowalski said, "Reeve, you're down." A pause. Then Reeve reached up with her right hand and unsealed the mask and pulled it down and turned toward Kowalski. And her face in the light of the flood lamps was streaked with the marks that oxygen masks leave after a long flight. And her eyes were the storm gray that they always were, and they were fully present, looking at Kowalski with the direct attention of someone who has returned from a very long distance and arrived exactly where they intended to be. She said, "How bad is the wing?" Kowalski looked at the wing. She said, "Bad." Reeve said, "Can it be fixed?" Kowalski said, "Yes." Reeve said, "Good." She began the shutdown sequence. Her hands moved through it with the same economy they had moved through everything else tonight, the muscle memory carrying the procedure forward without requiring conscious direction. The engines spooled down from idle through the decreasing registers of their shutdown, and the night, which had been full of their sound for hours, began to reassert its own character. The desert quiet and the wind, and the distant absence of the things that had filled the valley. When the last system was secured, she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. Then she climbed out. She descended the ladder slowly, not because she was injured, but because the body, after the kind of night she had put it through, deserves the small courtesy of being allowed to move at human pace. She stepped off the last rung onto the asphalt, and she stood there, and she looked at the aircraft. She put her hand on the fuselage. The metal was hot from the fire suppression and the heat of the engines, and the heat of everything the aircraft had done tonight. She left her hand there for a moment, not long enough, and then she walked toward the truck where Kowalski's crew was waiting with water and a medical kit and the quiet efficiency of people who understand that what is needed right now is not conversation, but logistics. In the main operations building, General Ferris Aldis had not left the command center since the aircraft had taken off. He had stood at the window and at the display, and at the window again, and he had spoken less than 20 words in the past 3 hours to the people around him who had conducted themselves with the professional discretion of people who understood that something larger than a standard operational situation was unfolding, and who were managing their piece of it without requiring guidance from above. He watched the track of the A-10 leave the valley and move south. He watched it reach the location of the forward station and disappear from the radar return in the way aircraft disappear when they are on the ground. He watched the radar return for the valley, which showed no enemy movement for the first time since the operation had begun. He thought about 28 people. A duty officer approached with a clipboard. He was young, a lieutenant, and he had the expression of someone performing a function he has been trained for and who is not entirely comfortable with the larger context of that function. He said, "Sir, I've been asked to present this for your signature." He placed the clipboard on the console beside Aldous. On it was a standard initiation document for formal proceedings. At the top of the form in the field marked Subject Someone had typed Captain Reeve Callahan. The fields for charges were filled in: unauthorized operation of military aircraft, failure to comply with direct order, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The signature line at the bottom was blank. Aldous picked up the pen from the clip at the top of the board. He held it. He looked at the form. He looked at the radar display, which showed the valley quiet, and the friendly unit's position indicator, stationary and stable, indicating a unit that had stopped moving in the way units stop moving when the immediate threat has resolved and they are consolidating before extraction. He looked at the form again. 1 second. 2. 3. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the building a phone rang and was answered. 4 seconds. 5. The duty officer stood at the edge of his peripheral vision, not moving, waiting. 6, 7, 8, 9. Aldous set the pen down on the console beside the clipboard. He straightened up. He walked to the window. He stood there and he looked at the Nevada night, and he did not pick the pen back up. Behind him, the duty officer looked at the unsigned form. He looked at the back of the general's head. He made a decision that was not in his training and not in his orders, and that he would never be entirely certain was correct, which was to pick up the clipboard and walk back to his station and place it in the pending file and say nothing. The room continued its work around both of them. Aldous stood at the window until dawn. The formal inquiry convened 3 weeks later in a building that smelled of old carpet and institutional coffee, and the accumulated weight of decisions made in rooms like it for longer than most of the people in it had been alive. It was not a court-martial. The distinction mattered. A court-martial is a conclusion being administered. An inquiry is a question being asked, which means the outcome is not yet determined, which means the person at the center of it occupies a different position than they would if the question had already been answered. Reeve Callahan sat at a table in her uniform, which she had not worn in the context of a formal proceeding in 3 years, and her hands were folded on the table in front of her, and she looked at the panel of officers facing her with the direct attention of someone who has decided that whatever happens in this room, she will meet it squarely. She had not brought a lawyer. This was her choice, and it had been explained to her that it was not advisable, and she had listened to the explanation and made the choice anyway. She had brought one thing: an envelope held in her hand under the table where the panel could not see it. The proceedings opened with the formal presentation of the events of the night in question: the unauthorized takeoff, the gun runs, the contact with the forward unit, the confrontation with the F-16 patrol, the forward refueling at Station Kilo Spur, the return to the valley, the final engagement, the emergency landing. It was a detailed and accurate account, and Reeve listened to it without expression. The panel heard from the 2 F-16 pilots. Captain James Wren described his intercept in the communication on the guard frequency and his decision to break off. He spoke precisely and without obvious emotion, and he did not use the word disobeyed in connection with his own actions, which was a careful choice. Lieutenant David Caulfield corroborated his account and added nothing material. The panel heard from the duty officers who had been present in the command center. They described what they had seen and what they had heard in the timeline of the general's communications and non-communications during the event. Aldous was in the room. He sat in the section reserved for witnesses, and he did not look at Reeve Callahan, and Reeve Callahan did not look at him. He had been interviewed separately 3 days prior, and his account of his own actions had been careful and incomplete in ways the investigators had noted, but not yet fully addressed. The panel's senior member asked Reeve if she wished to make a statement. She said she would defer her statement. She said she had asked that one additional witness be permitted to address the panel before she spoke. The senior member looked at his notes. He said that this had been arranged and was in order. Decker Holt walked in from the side door. He was not in uniform. He was in civilian clothes, dark pants, and a plain shirt which made him look in the context of the uniformed room like someone who had come in from outside the system, which in a sense he had. He walked to the witness chair with the unhurried stride of a man who has spent 20 years moving through difficult terrain and has no particular anxiety about one more difficult room. He sat down. The panel's senior member asked him to state his name, rank, and role in the events in question. He did. Then the senior member asked him if he had prepared a statement. He said no. He said, "I'd like to just tell you what happened." A pause. The senior member nodded. Holt looked at the panel. He said, 3 weeks ago, I told a 22-year-old soldier that no one was coming for us. I told him that because it was true. Command had told us there would be no air support. I had no reason to believe otherwise. I believed we were going to hold our position as long as we could, and that at some point before morning, the situation would resolve in the way situations resolve when they have no other options. I was not at peace with that outcome, but I had accepted it as the likely one. He paused. He said, at approximately 22:14 hours, an aircraft appeared over the valley. I did not know who was flying it. I did not ask. What I knew was that it was an A-10, that it was flying in a way I had never personally witnessed before, and that it was doing something that Command had explicitly told us would not happen. The pilot identified herself on the emergency frequency. We worked together for the next several hours. He looked at the table in front of him. He said, I want to be specific about something. This is not a story about an aircraft. This is not a story about a gun system or a flight envelope or a violation of standing orders. This is a story about a choice. 28 people were told they had been abandoned. One person decided that was not an acceptable situation and acted on that decision at considerable cost to herself. Every person who came home from that valley came home because of that choice. He said, I have been in this organization for 20 years. I have seen decisions made by people at many levels. I know the difference between a decision made in the interest of the people this organization is supposed to protect and a decision made in the interest of protecting something else. What happened 3 weeks ago in that valley was the first kind. What I understand to have happened 3 years ago to the person who made that choice was the second kind. He stopped. The room was very quiet. Then he reached into the chest pocket of his shirt and removed an envelope, soft at the creases from folding and unfolding. He held it on the table for a moment. He said, before this proceeding began today, Captain Callahan gave me this. She received it 3 weeks ago from Sergeant Kowalski. It was written by 3 of the 11 people who survived the events of 3 years ago. It took them 2 years to find someone who could pass it on to her. He said, I'm going to read one passage with the panel's permission. The senior member looked at the other members. He looked at Reeve. She was looking at the table. He said, proceed. Holt unfolded the letter. He said, we did not know your name until recently. We knew only the sound of your aircraft and the fact that you came when no one else did. We have tried to express to each other in the years since what it means to have been present in a situation where someone chooses to act on your behalf when every authority above them has decided you are expendable. We have not found the right words. What we have found is that we think about it every day, and we think about you every day. Whoever you are, he folded the letter, he placed it on the table. He said, that is all I have. He stood up and walked back to the side of the room and sat down. The panel conferred quietly. The senior member made a note. He looked at Reeve. He said, Captain Callahan, do you wish to make your statement at this time? She looked at him for a moment. She said, no. I think everything that needs to be said has been said. He held her gaze for a moment, and something in his expression shifted very slightly. A movement almost too small to name, though the people watching closely enough could see it. He said, the panel will take this matter under advisement. Your file will be annotated to reflect the proceedings. We will notify you of the panel's determination in due course. She said, understood. She stood. She gathered the envelope from the table, the one she had carried throughout the proceedings, and never opened herself because Holt had opened it, because the words were now in the room and could not be unspoken and did not need to be spoken again. She walked out. Aldous remained seated on his side of the room as people began to leave around him. He did not move for a long moment. On the screen at the front of the room, which had been used to display documents and timelines during the proceedings, someone had left the last image visible. It was a timestamp from the cockpit camera of the A-10 pulled from the aircraft's data recorder after the landing. A date and time from 3 years ago. His voice captured through the communications log, saying the words that had preceded 9 minutes of silence. Hold. Assess. Do not engage. He had known this recording existed. He had arranged 3 years ago for it to be classified at a level that removed it from standard review. He had not known that the classification had been reviewed following the events of 3 weeks ago, or that a copy had existed in a system he had not addressed, or that someone had provided it to the inquiry. He looked at the screen, he looked at his own words and the timestamp beneath them. He had spent 3 years telling himself the story of that night in a way that distributed its weight across factors he had not controlled and circumstances he could not have predicted, and the fog that attends decision-making in high-pressure situations. He was very good at telling stories. He had been telling them for 31 years. He knew which details to lead with and which to leave until the shape of the narrative was already established in the listener's mind. He looked at the timestamp. He looked at the 9 minutes between his voice on the recording and the first gun run from an unauthorized aircraft. He was alone in the room and there was no one to tell a story to, and in the absence of an audience, the story lost its structure and what remained was the timestamp and the 9 minutes, and the 4 names that had been read into the record earlier in the proceedings, the 4 names of the men who had died in those 9 minutes, and the 11 names of the men who had not. He sat there for a long time. Then he stood up and walked out of the building into the Nevada afternoon, which was bright and cold and indifferent to the proceedings that had just concluded within it, and he stood on the steps and looked at the mountains on the western horizon, and he knew with the quiet finality of something that has been approaching for a very long time and has now arrived that he was done, not relieved of command, not disgraced in a public way. Done in the way a person is done when the thing they have been maintaining requires more than they have remaining for it, when the architecture of the story they have been living inside has been exposed as architecture and cannot be re-inhabited with the same confidence. He would submit his retirement papers within the week. He had a cabin in Eastern Oregon that he had purchased 8 years ago with the intention of eventually spending time there. He had been there twice. He would go there. He walked down the steps toward his car. Reeve Callahan was standing at the edge of the parking lot. She was not waiting for him. She was standing in the space between the building and the road, and she was not looking at the building or at the cars or at the people moving past her. She was looking at the mountains the way people look at things that do not require anything of them in return. There was something in her posture that he recognized from a great distance, and with some difficulty, the posture of someone who has set down something very heavy and is standing in the first moment of not carrying it, getting used to the absence of the weight. He stopped on the steps. He had been in this organization for 31 years, and in those 31 years he had learned many things, and one of them was that the words available for moments like this one were never the right words. The words that would have been right were the ones that could not be unsaid once spoken, the ones that would require him to say clearly and without mitigation what had happened 3 years ago and what he had done about it and what it had cost. He was not certain he had those words available yet. He was not certain the man he currently was could say them in a way that would be true rather than simply strategic. He walked down the remaining steps. He walked past her close enough that she could have turned and seen him if she had chosen to look. She did not turn. He reached his car and got in. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel before he started the engine. He looked at the windshield, at the afternoon light coming through it, at the mountains beyond the edge of the lot, where she still stood, still looking at something he could no longer see. He started the engine. When he drove out of the lot, she was still there. The sound of footsteps approached her from behind her. She knew who it was before she turned. She turned anyway. Tyler Hatch was standing there in his uniform, and he was standing the way young soldiers stand when they have been through something and are not entirely certain how to carry themselves on the other side of it, upright but not at ease, present but still processing. He said, "I didn't know if you'd come out this way." She said, "I needed air." He looked at the mountains. He said, "Me too." They stood there for a moment in the companionship of two people who have been through the same thing from different positions and understand that what they share is not identical and does not need to be. He said, "I'm 22 years old and I thought I knew what this looked like. 3 weeks ago, I thought I understood it, what combat was, what it meant, what people were." He stopped. He said, "You taught me what it sounds like." She looked at him. He was very young. She had known he was young from his voice on the radio, from the quality of the fear in it, and the quality of the will that had worked alongside the fear through all of it. Standing here in the afternoon light, she could see it more completely, the youth of him, the specific unfinishedness of a person who has not yet had enough time to know what they are going to become and who has just had one of the experiences that will shape what they do become. She reached into her jacket pocket. The squadron patch was there where she had put it before entering the building that morning. She held it in her hand for a moment. The faded colors, the worn edges, the embroidered aircraft that still kept its shape despite the years, the motto across the bottom. She placed it in his hand. She said, "Keep it, for when you need to remember why you do this. Because there will be days when you don't remember and you'll need something to hold on to." He looked at it in his palm. He looked up at her. He said, "What do you hold on to now?" She considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. She said the flying. He nodded slowly. He folded his fingers over the patch. They stood for a moment more in the Nevada afternoon light, and then she shook his hand, which he accepted with both of his in the way that young people accept gestures from older people who have earned the right to make them, and then she walked away across the parking lot toward the road. She did not look back. Hangar 14 was empty when she walked through it that evening. The aircraft was gone. It had been transported to a maintenance facility 2 days after the landing, the damage documented and assessed, and the repair process begun. The hangar that had held the aircraft for 3 years, that Kowalski had tended in the margins of her authorized duties, that had held the readiness and the possibility of this night, was simply a hangar again. A large empty space with fluorescent lights and a concrete floor and the faint pervasive smell of jet fuel that never fully leaves a place where aircraft have lived. She walked to the center of the floor. There were marks on the concrete, not the marks of long disuse, the marks of a specific aircraft in a specific position maintained over time, the dark crescents of the wheel positions, the faint oil trace of the left main gear seal that had been weeping slightly for as long as she could remember. The outline of the aircraft's footprint on the floor preserved in the negative impression of its absence. She stood in it. The fluorescent lights hummed. Outside the hangar door, which she had left open behind her, the Nevada evening was doing what Nevada evenings do, the light going gold and then red, and then the deep blue that precedes the dark, the temperature dropping with the efficiency of high desert that has no patience for transitions. She stood in the ghost of the aircraft's footprint, and she did not feel what she might have expected to feel, which was the weight of unresolved things, the pending file, the still uncertain official status of who she was and what she was permitted to do. Those things were present, but they were not the largest thing in the room. The largest thing was simpler. She had flown. After 3 years of desk and manifests and discipline, about not looking at the flight line in the evenings after the accumulated weight of being made to feel like a signature at the bottom of a form. No one reads. She had climbed into an aircraft and the aircraft had answered her, and the men on the ground had come home, and the thing she had been told no longer existed in her had been there the entire time, intact, unchanged by the years and the paperwork and the silence. She looked at her hand. She had given the patch to Hatch. She stood in the empty hangar and thought about what he had asked her. "What do you hold on to now?" And she had said the flying, which was true. But standing here, she understood that it was not the whole truth or not the part of the truth that mattered most right now. What she held on to was this: she had been there when it counted. She had been exactly what she was not, what the institution had decided she was not: the logistics officer, or the erased file, or the cautionary story told in hallways, but the thing she had always actually been. And 28 people were alive because that was true. No administrative decision could reach back into that night and change what had happened there. No pending file could unstrike the hours she had flown. No signature on a form could erase the valley. She was not finished. She walked out of Hangar 14 and into the Nevada evening, and she did not look back at the empty space behind her, because what was in that empty space was already inside her and had been all along. She walked toward the flight line. She looked at the sky. It was wide and dark and full of the things she had always known it to hold. General Ferris Aldis submitted his retirement papers 6 months after the inquiry. The announcement cited 31 years of distinguished service and a desire to pursue personal interests. No ceremony was held at his request. The item ran once in the official service bulletin and once in a brief notice in a defense publication that covered senior officer transitions, and then it passed from the record the way things pass when they are not remarkable enough to hold attention. Sergeant Dana Kowalski was commended for her management of the forward arming and refueling point during the night of the incident. The commendation described the operation of the station as an example of initiative and logistical excellence under challenging conditions. It did not mention what the station had been used for. She accepted the commendation and said nothing about the letter she had held for 2 years, or the 3 men who had written it, or the conversation she had had at the top of a ladder while an aircraft's engines idled beneath her. Some things are not in the commendation. That does not mean they are not in the record. Captain Reeve Callahan's service file remained in review status for 14 months. What happened after that is not part of the record that is publicly accessible. Tyler Hatch served 3 more deployments over the following 4 years. People who served with him described a particular quality in him difficult to name, precisely a kind of equanimity in difficult situations that the people around him found steadying. When asked about it, he never explained it directly. He kept something in the inside pocket of his jacket in every deployment, through every difficult night. He was asked about it once by a younger soldier in his unit, a 20-year-old from rural Georgia, who had found herself in her first real engagement and was sitting in the aftermath of it, trying to locate the thread that had pulled her through. He thought about the question for a moment. Then he took the patch from his pocket and held it out. It was worn at the edges. The colors had faded to something approximate of their original red and black and gold. The embroidered outline of an aircraft still held its shape. He said, "Someone gave this to me when I needed to remember why I was doing this. I'm giving it to you for the same reason. Pass it on when someone needs it more than you do." She took it. He did not explain further. He did not need to. The A-10 was repaired at a cost and timeline the maintenance report described as within acceptable parameters given the nature of the damage. When the repairs were complete, the aircraft was assessed as non-mission capable due to airframe hours and transferred to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Tucson, Arizona, where it was placed on static display in the Modern Flight Gallery. The identification placard on the display lists the aircraft's type. It lists the dates of its operational service. It notes the aircraft's assignment history. At the bottom in the field designated for pilot information, 4 words are printed in the standard institutional font used for all the placards in the gallery. Pilot unknown. Some things are kept in institutions, documents and records and official accounts, things that can be filed and retrieved and cited and referenced. These things have their value. Some things are kept elsewhere. In the memory of 28 people who came home from a valley with no name on most maps, who went back to their families and their lives, and who carry that night with them, not as a weight, but as a kind of knowledge, the knowledge of what it means to be abandoned and then found. In the hands of soldiers who receive a worn patch from other soldiers and are told simply to pass it on when someone needs it more than they do. In the sound of twin turbofan engines that a crew chief in her 40s still hears sometimes on the edge of sleep, the note of them cycling up from idle toward power, the sound of something that has been waiting a long time finally deciding to go. In the marks on the floor of an empty hangar, in the way that certain things, once they have been true, cannot be made untrue by the passage of time or the revision of records or the silence of the people who were present. The hangar is empty. The concrete remembers the shape of what stood in it. Out in Tucson on an afternoon when the desert light comes in low and gold through the museum's high windows, a man in his late 60s stands in front of the A-10 and reads the placard. He is not military or was not or was something adjacent to it in ways that are not obvious from looking at him. He reads the placard and he reads the last line, and he stands there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. A museum docent, a young woman of perhaps 25, notices him standing there longer than most people stand. She says, "That one has quite a history." He says, "I know a little about it." She says, "There's not much on record. The pilot information is listed as unknown. We've tried to research it, but the records from that period are incomplete." He looks at the shark mouth, the faded paint, the patches and repairs along the wing route that someone who knew what they were looking for could identify as the work of significant battle damage, professionally addressed, not hidden, simply fixed and returned to service and eventually retired. He says sometimes the records are incomplete on purpose. She considers this. She says, "Do you know who flew it?" He is quiet for a moment. He says, "I know someone who does." He does not explain further. He reaches into the inside pocket of his jacket where he has kept something for a long time, through more years and more nights than he could easily count, and he holds it for a moment in his hand, and then he puts it back. He looks at the aircraft for another moment, then he walks on. That is enough.